Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina was born on October 24, 1891, in San Cristobal, a town situated not far from the capital Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. He was born into a relatively modest family, with his father José Trujillo Valdez working in various jobs and his mother Altagracia Julia Molina Chevalier providing stability in the household. The family had Spanish, Haitian, and possibly French ancestry, a background that placed them among the racially mixed society of the Dominican Republic. From a young age Rafael displayed qualities of ambition, strong will, and discipline, even though his early life was marked by financial struggle and limited access to education. He attended primary school but soon developed a greater interest in practical skills, order, and authority rather than academics. By his teenage years he was already being recognized for his ability to lead and his tendency to impose his will on others. In his youth, Trujillo worked in various low-level occupations including as a telegraph operator and later as part of a rural police force. This early work exposed him to discipline, bureaucracy, and the power structures of the Dominican Republic. The country at the time was politically unstable and frequently influenced by foreign powers. The United States had occupied the Dominican Republic in 1916, and this occupation lasted until 1924. During these years, Rafael Trujillo took an important step that would define his future. He joined the National Guard, a military force established under the guidance of the United States Marines, designed to replace the fragmented Dominican Army. Trujillo excelled in the ranks of the National Guard. His ability to impose strict discipline, his ambition, and his loyalty to superiors caught the attention of those in command. He quickly rose through the ranks, and by 1925 he had reached the rank of second lieutenant. This rapid rise reflected not only his abilities but also his willingness to learn modern military practices from the Americans. Trujillo became known for his obsession with order, uniformity, and control, traits that would later define his political rule. When the American forces left the Dominican Republic in 1924, the National Guard was transformed into the Dominican National Army, and Trujillo became its leading figure. The withdrawal of the United States created a political vacuum in the country, and new elections were held. President Horacio Vázquez came to power, but his rule was plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and unrest. Trujillo carefully positioned himself within the army to remain indispensable to whichever political faction prevailed. By the late 1920s he had already gained significant influence within the military, and he understood that control of the armed forces could pave the way for political power. In 1930, political instability gave Trujillo the opening he had long been waiting for. A rebellion against President Vázquez broke out, and while Trujillo was officially tasked with suppressing it, he secretly negotiated with the rebels. By withholding full military action and allowing the rebellion to gain ground, Trujillo ensured the downfall of Vázquez. In the subsequent elections of 1930, Trujillo presented himself as the candidate for president. The elections were heavily rigged, with widespread intimidation and fraud carried out by his supporters and military loyalists. As expected, Trujillo won with an overwhelming margin and assumed the presidency in August 1930. Trujillo wasted no time in consolidating power. He established a regime that combined ruthless authoritarianism with carefully staged propaganda. One of his first major challenges came in September 1930, just 1 month after his inauguration, when a devastating hurricane struck the capital Santo Domingo. The destruction was immense, but Trujillo used the disaster to his advantage. He organized relief efforts, portrayed himself as the savior of the nation, and rebuilt parts of the city. In gratitude, the city of Santo Domingo was renamed Ciudad Trujillo in his honor, an example of the cult of personality he would build around himself. Over the following years, Trujillo constructed a totalitarian system in the Dominican Republic. He placed loyalists in all branches of government, established a pervasive secret police network, and crushed all opposition with violence, imprisonment, or exile. He cultivated an image of himself as the benefactor of the fatherland and later as the Generalissimo. His portrait was displayed everywhere, his name was attached to streets, buildings, and institutions, and school children were taught to revere him as the protector of the nation. While his rule was undeniably oppressive, Trujillo also sought to modernize the Dominican Republic and leave a mark of progress. He invested in infrastructure, built roads, improved ports, and encouraged industrial development. Agriculture was also developed, with sugar, coffee, and tobacco production expanding under his watch. Trujillo encouraged foreign investment but always ensured that he and his family gained the greatest benefits. Over time he and his relatives amassed enormous personal wealth, controlling vast portions of the economy. Despite these developments, his rule was marked by brutality and fear. One of the darkest episodes came in 1937, in what became known as the Parsley Massacre. Trujillo ordered the massacre of tens of thousands of Haitians living along the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. His motive was to assert Dominican nationalism and reduce Haitian influence in the country. Dominican soldiers and civilians carried out mass killings, asking suspected Haitians to pronounce the Spanish word for parsley, perejil. Those who could not pronounce it in the Dominican way were executed. Estimates of the dead range from 12,000 to more than 20,000. The massacre shocked the international community, but Trujillo largely avoided serious consequences because of his careful diplomacy with the United States and other powers. Trujillo was a master at balancing repression at home with favorable relations abroad. He cultivated close ties with the United States, presenting himself as a staunch anti-communist at a time when the world was increasingly divided by ideological conflict. He supported U.S. policies and maintained stability in the Dominican Republic, which made him a useful ally despite his brutal methods. Over the years his regime would face criticism from international organizations and governments, but Trujillo survived by alternating between concessions and displays of strength. By the 1940s Trujillo had firmly entrenched himself in power. Though he sometimes stepped down from the presidency to allow others to take the office, he always remained the real authority in the Dominican Republic, controlling the army, the police, and the economy. His family members were placed in positions of influence, and the country effectively became his personal domain. His rule was one of absolute control, and while he could point to economic progress and modernization as evidence of success, it came at the cost of freedom, justice, and thousands of lives crushed under the weight of his dictatorship. Rafael Trujillo entered the later years of his rule with the same ambition and ruthlessness that had carried him to power. By the late 1940s and 1950s, he had consolidated every aspect of Dominican life under his hand. The military was loyal only to him, the National Congress obeyed his directives without question, and even the judiciary functioned as an extension of his authority. He created a personality cult so intense that it rivaled those of the most infamous dictators of the 20th century. Cities, streets, and even the highest mountain in the country were renamed in his honor. School children were required to recite prayers giving thanks for Trujillo, and churches placed plaques on their walls reading God in heaven, Trujillo on earth. In this carefully crafted image, he presented himself not only as a leader but as a savior of the Dominican Republic, the one man who brought order, stability, and prosperity to a land once plagued by turmoil. Yet beneath this grand facade lay a reign defined by violence and fear. Trujillo used the secret police to hunt down any form of dissent. Those who dared to oppose him risked imprisonment, torture, or death. Political opponents were eliminated through assassinations disguised as accidents, and exiles who spoke out abroad often faced kidnappings or murders planned by his agents. The very mention of criticism could lead to entire families being punished. Trujillo understood that terror was his most effective tool, and he wielded it with ruthless efficiency. Despite this climate of fear, many Dominicans acknowledged that his rule brought some economic growth and modernization. He invested heavily in infrastructure, building roads, ports, and public buildings. He encouraged the growth of industries such as textiles and sugar, and foreign investors were lured into the country. In comparison with other Caribbean nations, the Dominican Republic under Trujillo did achieve some stability and progress. However, most of the wealth created was diverted into his own hands. He and his family controlled vast portions of the national economy, owning businesses ranging from sugar mills to airlines. At one point, it was estimated that Trujillo and his relatives controlled nearly two-thirds of the Dominican economy. His foreign policy was also shaped by ambition and brutality. In 1937, he ordered one of the most infamous massacres in the history of the Americas. In what became known as the Parsley Massacre, Dominican troops and militias slaughtered thousands of Haitians living near the border. The massacre was carried out with shocking cruelty, with victims forced to pronounce the Spanish word for parsley to reveal their Haitian identity. Trujillo justified the act as a defense of Dominican sovereignty and racial purity, but it exposed the darkest side of his nationalism. The international outcry was significant, but his regime survived, partly because larger powers such as the United States preferred to tolerate his rule in exchange for regional stability. During World War II, Trujillo aligned himself with the Allies, hoping to improve his image abroad. He offered asylum to Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, an act that earned him some international praise. However, his motives were not purely humanitarian, as he sought to populate certain regions of the Dominican Republic with Europeans to reinforce his vision of racial whitening. He later attempted to present himself as a defender of the Western Hemisphere against communism, particularly during the Cold War, a strategy that allowed him to maintain support from the United States despite his brutal methods. The 1950s brought both the peak of his power and the beginning of his decline. He continued to lavishly celebrate himself, hosting grand parades, anniversaries, and international conferences where he was the central figure. His vanity reached such levels that he forced public officials and ordinary citizens to display portraits of him in their homes and offices. At the same time, his paranoia deepened. He grew increasingly suspicious of disloyalty within his ranks, and even close allies could suddenly fall victim to purges or assassinations. Tensions with the Catholic Church also emerged as clergy began to criticize his excesses and abuses. The Church's condemnation of his dictatorship struck at the heart of his legitimacy, for religion had always been an integral part of Dominican life. Trujillo responded with hostility, increasing repression of priests and church leaders. This further alienated him from parts of the population who had previously tolerated his rule. Internationally, his actions grew more reckless. In 1960, his agents attempted to assassinate the Venezuelan president Romulo Betancourt by planting a bomb in his car. The attempt failed but caused widespread outrage across Latin America. This reckless attack pushed many governments to break diplomatic relations with the Dominican Republic, and the Organization of American States imposed sanctions. For the first time, Trujillo found himself increasingly isolated on the world stage. At home, opposition was growing bolder. The brutal murder of the Mirabal sisters in 1960 became a turning point. These three women, known as the Butterflies, were political activists who openly opposed Trujillo. Their assassination, carried out by regime agents, shocked the nation and turned them into enduring symbols of resistance. The crime weakened his support further and convinced many that his rule had reached intolerable levels of cruelty. By 1961, the dictator who had once seemed invincible was facing a storm of enemies both inside and outside the country. The United States, once his most reliable ally, was now reconsidering its support. Washington feared that continued backing of Trujillo would destabilize the region and fuel communist movements. Quietly, American intelligence agencies began to signal support for elements within the Dominican military who were plotting against him. On the evening of May 30, 1961, Rafael Trujillo's reign of terror came to a violent end. While traveling in his car outside the capital, he was ambushed by a group of assassins, many of whom were former allies who had turned against him. He was shot multiple times and died on the spot. The dictator who had ruled the Dominican Republic with iron control for over 30 years was gone, leaving behind a nation both relieved and fearful of what would come next. In the aftermath, his family attempted to maintain power, but the regime quickly unraveled. His relatives fled into exile, and his statues and symbols of authority were torn down. Yet the shadow of his rule remained. The Dominican Republic had been reshaped by his dictatorship, for better and for worse. He had modernized parts of the country, created infrastructure, and brought a measure of stability. But he had also drenched the land in blood, destroyed democratic institutions, and left a legacy of fear. Historians continue to debate the meaning of Rafael Trujillo's rule. Some emphasize the order and progress he brought in comparison to earlier instability, while others focus on the cruelty, corruption, and human cost of his dictatorship. What is undeniable is the scale of his impact. For over 3 decades, one man dominated every aspect of Dominican life, and even decades after his death, the memory of his rule continues to shape the national consciousness.